And it is time for a chat with Pat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And today we have with us Jacob Phillips. He's a professor of systematic theology at St. Mary's University in Twickenham and the author of John Henry Newman and the English Sensibility. And he wrote an article in First Things called Newman Against Compromise. Great article. Jacob, good to have you on. How you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, I really love this article because you kind of cut through this idea that Newman could be portrayed kind of as, his big achievement is more of a path, you say, toward a kind of multiculturalism. But then you kind of say you don't think that portrait is accurate. Can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Newman's become an infamous figure, really, rather than just famous. And when someone becomes very well known, obviously different people will try and co-opt them for their own purposes. Yes. With Newman, he's been used by people, I think, a bit wrongly. And although with a measure of controversy in the article, I disagree with some comments that were made by the then Prince Charles, of course, now King Charles, who suggested that one of Newman's great gifts was enabling people to understand religious differences and therefore opening the door to multiculturalism. And I thought that wasn't really a fair representation of Newman, because if there's one thing Newman believed, it's that the Catholic religion is true and exclusively true.
So, and you kind of have a spiritual personal connection, because you talk about you crossed the Tiber also. So and that helped you dig back into Newman, right? It gave you a different view of him?
Yes, that's right. So I'm a convert, and I always related to Newman because, like Newman, I went from being low church, what we call low church, so evangelical Anglican, to high Anglican, Anglo-Catholic, and then I became very disillusioned with that way of approaching the Christian faith, and became convinced as to the truth of the true Catholicism, i.e. the Catholicism of Rome. So I always felt a very deep personal connection to Newman, and Newman's arguments were a great source of orientation for me around converting, particularly arguments around papal authority and the way that doctrine develops. I mean, these were things that really enabled me to make sense of Catholicism and indeed want to become a participant in the faith myself.
And I think even sometimes those kinds of, some of his writings in those areas that you just spoke of are co-opted also. I've read things that I'm thinking, I don't think that's what Newman said, and I had to go back and double check. But I want to kind of get to, you talk about Newman identified with the struggles of the church in the 4th century. Can you fill our audience in on that?
Yes, so one of Newman's accounts of his conversion is particularly poetically and dramatically expressed, and this is how, in the 4th century, he says there were 3 camps, 3 opposing groups. And one is very famous, the heretical group, the Arians, who believed that Jesus was not God. And then there was what we today call the Orthodox, which was the position of Rome, which was that Jesus is God. Mm-hmm. And then this third group emerged, which were based on the principle of compromise, and tried to argue that Jesus was sort of God. He was semi-divine, but not fully divine. And this third group emerged. They were called the semi-Arians because they were a little bit Arian, but not quite. They emerged not because they thought this was true about Jesus, but because they thought this would enable everybody to get on with each other and they could pull everyone together. So it was a decision made not on the basis of faith or theology. It was made on the basis of political expedience. Now, when Newman read about this, he wrote about feeling absolutely terrified. He said he broke out in a cold sweat. And he looked in the mirror and could see the face of a semi-Aryan looking back at him, i.e., he realized he had jeopardized the truth of who Jesus really is for reasons of political expedience, and that he could no longer do that and would have to convert to Rome.
Wow. I think, and that really brings us, because even before his conversion, if I understand your article correctly, he had a trouble with an Anglican bishop who said public utility and truth coincides. Is that kind of a more modern way of looking at the semi-Arians?
Exactly, yes, that's exactly right. So the semi-Arians decided they could discover who the truth of Jesus was, as according to what was most useful for them at the time, politically. And there was a contemporary of Newman's, as you say, Bishop Warburton, who was of the view that utility, usefulness, and truth are effectively the same thing. It's something we see in things like liberation theology, the idea that how useful something is defines whether or not it's true. And I mean, if people want to believe that, then they're free to do so. But it's a radical departure from the Christian tradition and from the understanding of truth one sees in someone like Thomas Aquinas, which is that something is true if it corresponds with reality. Not whether it's useful or not is neither here nor there. It's whether or not it corresponds with reality that's important. And it was that realization that Newman underwent, I think.
So do you believe then that there really is no longer a middle path between Christianity and secular society?
Well, I think ultimately, I think that's right. And I think if I think about my own lifetime as a professional theologian, I've been working in universities now for 10 years. I think it's getting easier to articulate that position, and it's becoming clearer. So secular society has gone, I think, further down the road of secularism than it has done before, and there's all sorts of strange ideas and strange practices around. And people are reacting against that, I think, rediscovering the truth of the Christian faith and becoming more aware of what we as a society, and I say we as a British person, which is significantly more secular than an American context, what we as a secular society have lost. Now, I think Newman he's humane, he's a very wise man, very sensible writings, and he would understand that in day-to-day life, on a social level, one has to make pragmatic, sensible decisions, and he would always be uneasy about any sort of fanaticism or fundamentalism or anything like that. But ultimately, theologically, I don't think the secular world now has anything to offer in terms of compromising with Christianity. I think it's a time for Catholics to be robust, forthright, and confident in their faith. And that's the impression I get from culture at the moment. The time is right for us to speak out about what matters to us.
And can you kind of enlighten me in the sense of, we talk about Christian unity, right? That the kind of the ecumenical movement, how can we bring this unity? But so often we look at it in terms of compromise. That would not be the correct way to approach this, right?
No, I don't think it would. Excuse me. No, so I don't think that's the correct way to approach ecumenical dialogue as it's described in magisterial documents like Unitatis with Integratio from the Council and documents which have followed on from that. I think that the dialogue is important fully to understand the differences, but there are fundamental differences regarding which there can be no compromise. Now, interestingly, if you think about Anglicanism, which is the context for Newman, there has been the erection of the Anglican Ordinariate. And the Ordinariate was very clear that on matters of doctrine, on matters of faith, all those coming into Rome are expected to convert entirely and absolutely. On matters of culture, what it calls Anglican patrimony, so particular hymns, particular approaches to the liturgy and so forth, there is a way in which some of the cultural sensibility of Anglicanism could be worked into Catholic worship. But on the fundamentals of doctrine, there's no room for compromise in that document. Now, I would understand that to be the aim of ecumenical dialogue is for Christians of other denominations to re-enter the fold and to come home and be prepared to convert fully to the Catholic faith. That's what ecumenical dialogue is for. And if I engage in dialogue, and I do sometimes, I'm asked to on behalf of a bishop here on occasion, it's very clear that the purpose of the dialogue from the Catholic perspective is to enable the people to understand the Catholic faith better so that they can convert. The idea isn't that we simply find a way to coexist with our different interpretations of what Christianity is. That doesn't quite capture what's at stake, I think.
Wow, Jacob, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a great conversation. Have a good week ahead and a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.
Our guest today, Jacob Phillips, professor of systematic theology at St. Mary's University, Twickenham, and author of John Henry Newman and the English Sensibility. And we were talking about his article in First Things, Newman Against Compromise.